All right, hey everybody, welcome back. Just getting things underway here. Sorry it's close to our class time, but um, we're not late, so that's not a problem. Anyways, welcome back. It's about to be 9 a.m. and this is Wednesday, April the 29th. So we are going to just go over some more notes on the philosophy of mind. That's our current topic. Got a little bit of material left, just two authors. So we'll do our best to cover for sure JJC Smart today, and then maybe we'll start talking about Alan Turing, and then whatever's left over, we'll just take care of that on Friday. So class is just moving ahead. Everything seems to be going pretty well according to schedule, at least. Thank you guys for being up and being a part of this. If you feel like saying hi or just any kind of comments or questions, as always, let me know. I'm right here and I'm ready to assist with anything I can. But yeah, we still got a few minutes and then we'll really get cracking on this lecture today. Hey Trevor, good to see you there. Good morning. Another minute and we'll be good to go. Just getting my camera good here. It's pretty decent. Okay. Kitty. Hi. Cat's wandering around. Okay, guys. Well, I think it's pretty much there. It's 9 a.m. So welcome back, everyone. Good morning to you guys. Feel free to just say hello. It's always good to know who's here, who's watching, and who's actually in the live stream. So feel free to say good morning, hello, or anything else. But as I'm saying, it's always nice to see you guys and have this chance to meet in the morning and talk a little bit about philosophy. Hi, Marissa. Okay. Well. As usual, like I always keep reminding you guys, let me know if you do have questions about anything at all involving this class, involving the topics. It's definitely a good thing for us, and we all benefit from, an exchange and a little interaction. Okay, so let's go back into our notes. But who else is here? Come on, I said say hello. So I see eight people, but I only saw 2 people say hello. What's wrong? You don't want to say hi to me? Let's say hi. So I'm going to wait for that before I go on. Okay, hi Matthew, how are you? I replied to your message, by the way, so hopefully you noticed that. Who else is in the house? Hey Mason, good to see you there. Okay, got a couple people. Who else? I'm not in a rush. So just want to chill for a minute. How's it going, you guys? What have you been up to? How's the quarantine? How's life? Is everything all right? Hopefully. Just letting you guys know that, we're here and we're having a little human interaction. If people are just watching the live stream later, that's not the best ideal case scenario. It's also not Kantian, right? Because you couldn't will that be a universal action. If that was what everybody did, thinking, well, someone else will interact with him, and then they'll be the ones that substitute for me, so therefore I can just watch it at my leisure. Of course, provided that the person's in the same time zone and it's not impossible for them to do that. But I mean, take that as the case, right? If everybody did it, then we'd have an empty lecture and it would just be me, talking to the camera, which wouldn't be perfect. But anyways, guys, thanks so much for being here this morning. We have a couple of more items to attend to. So we're working through the notes on the philosophy of mind, and we've now finished with two of the authors. So starting off, we looked at Descartes. Descartes gave an argument for dualism, which is the position that everything in the universe is made out of two types of substances. So the dualists claim that there's both physical matter, things that are extended in space made out of atoms, but then that there are also the non-physical immaterial minds, which just have consciousness and think. And he gave the argument based on the conceivability of the two things existing separately. And why is that something that really could be separate? Because it's clearly and distinctly conceivable. And according to his argument, God, who is known to exist because we can have the idea of him, which is the idea of an infinite being, so it has to come from an infinite source. God is perfectly good, so he's not a deceiver, and that therefore implies that he would not allow you to be wrong about clear and distinct perceptions. So since you can clearly conceive of or think of the mind and body existing separately, they must really be capable of existing separately in reality. And then, okay, so after that, it was last lecture, a couple meetings on Daniel Stoljar. Hi there, Logan. Good to see you too. So Daniel Stoljar's argument was for physicalism. So first of all, he says the position of physicalism is just the idea that everything is physical. And within physicalism, he says we should look at two questions, the interpretation question and the truth question. The interpretation question just asks, what does it mean to say everything is physical? The truth question asks, is it true that everything's physical? And he says you got to tackle the interpretation question first, because you can't determine whether a statement's true or false if you don't know what it means. So, okay, to understand the interpretation of what it means to say that everything's physical, you have to utilize the concept of supervenience. So supervenience is a concept that's best illustrated through the example of like a dot matrix image. So a dot matrix image is something that is a picture, but it's made out of a bunch of tiny little dots assembled in a particular order. And when you have such an image, if you had a second composite that was exactly a copy of the first in terms of the placement of each dot, then it would have to have all the same features as the first one had. So the term global features is introduced. That's just a word to refer to any large-scale aspect of a composite structure like a dot matrix. So if the same exact atomic features exist in both of the composites, then the same global features would exist. And if there were different global features, then by hypothesis, they would have to have a different arrangement of dots. This could also be understood through the case of mosaics or pixels, but at any rate, that's the example. Now, the physical universe is compared to these dot matrices because it's claimed that the physical universe and everything within it is kind of like a big matrix in the sense that it's made out of a bunch of little tiny parts, except in this case, we're talking about atoms. So in the same way as supervenience claims, since everything supervenes on the atoms, then if there were another universe which had the same atomic distribution of particles, it would have to have the same large-scale features too. And therefore, your consciousness and everything that you're thinking and experiencing mentally or otherwise is itself a result of the supervenience on the atoms. So in a second universe that was an atomic duplicate of ours, the consciousness exhibited by the duplicate of you would be exactly the same. So that means that consciousness really is just made out of matter, since an identical material system would generate the same consciousness. Okay, and then after that, he tried to defend physicalism and show that it's true. So he tried to answer the truth question by giving two further arguments. One was the argument from causal closure, and the other was the argument from methodological naturalism. Causal closure says every event that has a cause has a physical cause. The mind can cause your behavior. Like if you just think, raise your hand and it happens, so your mind can make the arm or whatever body part move. And then the third premise says that if something's the cause of something else, basically it's the only cause. There can't be two, there's just one cause for each effect. So since your brain is the physical cause of your bodily behavior, and since there's only one cause maximum for each effect, then that would imply that the physical basis of your behavior is the only basis. So it's not both the brain and also the mind, just the physical brain. Then the other argument was the argument from methodological naturalism, which basically just says that it's reasonable to go with science, to believe what the scientists believe, and they assume physicalism is true, so that's reasonable. Okay, so that brings us now to today, and so we're going to continue on this same theme for a little bit longer. Today's meeting is about another physicalist author, so I'm going to get a second look at physicalism again, and this is from J.J.C. Smart. Okay, so J.J.C. Smart lived from 1920 until, so this book came out in 2008, but I think he's passed away since then. So let me double check his dates. I think he died in 2012, but I'm not 100% sure, so I'm going to double check that right now on the phone. And yes, that's true. So he did live until 2012. Okay, and the paper that we're looking at here is called Sensations and Brain Processes from 1959. 1959, Sensations and Brain Processes. So, yes, J.J.C. Smart, Sensations and Brain Processes. So his overall position in this paper is that any state of consciousness that you could ever have, happiness, anger, fear, having dreams, the taste of ice cream, the sound of music, any experience that you can have as a conscious being, which he just labels sensations. All that those are, as he's trying to argue, are just brain processes. So like the fact that your brain is in a specific physical chemical state is the equivalent of the experience that you report having. So like when you're happy and stuff, basically it would be like, oh, there's dopamine receptors in the brain that are firing, and therefore this chemical fact, this physical fact, that's all that it is, what you call happiness. So every experience, every sensation that you can possibly conceive of a conscious being like yourself has, those are just brain processes, according to his argument. And so if sensations are just brain processes, then that supports physicalism, because the brain is physical. So that's his position, that anything we could call a sensation or a state of consciousness is ultimately identical to a brain process. So his thesis is kind of this identity thesis. He sometimes states it almost like as an equation in math. Sensations equal brain processes. So this is like his major claim in the paper, that a sensation is just identical to a brain process. Now notice that this is not saying that there's two things that have a connection to each other. Like saying if I have a neighbor, that's not that I am the neighbor. It just means that I have a relation to a person who lives next door, right? But in this case, it's a little bit even more bold than that. It's saying sensations literally are brain processes. So like these are just two words for the same thing. Trevor, you say this. So in order to think, physicalism just boils it down to the order that neurons fire. Yeah, I mean, that's what the claim is, that thinking, feeling, having ideas, imagining things, whatever's going on in your head mentally is just the brain process that it exists at that time. So a person feeling of any particular way, having any mental state at all, is just the particular configuration of the brain and its processes at that point in time. So the neurons, the synapses, the connecting tissues and all of that, the different centers of the brain, the cortex, the parietal lobe and all of that. These are prefrontal lobe. These are just the physical bases for your consciousness, and your consciousness is just a brain process. So he's not saying that there's two things and that they're kind of connected, like there's the brain process and then there's the sensation and they sort of relate to each other. He's saying they are the same thing, just being labeled by two different words. Like you could call me a musician and a professor, but I'm just one person now, and that's two labels applied to me. So what's being said here is that your sensations just are brain processes by another name. But they're nothing over and beyond the physical brain process. Now, why is he so interested in this idea or this claim? The way he sees it, it would be very odd if sensations were somehow the only thing that is left out from our contemporary scientific worldview, which increasingly seems more and more able to explain everything about reality in terms of the ultimate physical and chemical constituents of reality. If consciousness, for example, was not a brain process, and it was something that was a mysterious, non-physical thing, then it would be what is called a nomological dangler. So little vocabulary for us really quick. Nomological dangler, term that he now introduces. Nomological dangler. The word just means something that remains unexplained by the physical sciences, basically something that remains unexplained by science. Unexplained by science. Okay, hopefully you can see that definition of nomological dangler there at the bottom of the board. Something that remains unexplained by science, something that science has not been able to fully capture or explain within its set of principles and laws. Now, scientists, the goal they have, right, is to explain, what do you think, everything about reality or just a lot of it? I'll just tell you, the goal of science is to explain everything about reality according to scientific and natural laws. So it would represent a failure of scientific explanation if something remained incapable of explanation according to the scientific method. So a nomological dangler is like a thing that a scientist does not like, right? Because it represents a failure of science to give a scientific or physical explanation of something. And the hope of science anyway, even if it's not yet been fully achieved, is not just to explain some things about reality, like let's talk about how stars form and how volcanoes erupt and how earthquakes happen and how, molecules coalesce in space or on the surface of a planet. It's not only interested in those things, it's interested in everything. So it's not like, according to science, we should just talk about everything that's outside of us, but when it comes to human consciousness, just leave that alone. That's something that we really can't fully approach scientifically. So the scientist believes that everything should be capable of scientific explanation, and if something couldn't be, then it would be one of these nomological danglers, and that would be something that lacks scientific explanation. It would therefore be contrary to the stated goal of science to give good explanations for everything, not just some things. Now, nomological, coming from the Greek word nomos, which means of law or of pertaining to law. So a nomological dangler would be, therefore, something that is dangling outside of the body of knowledge that we've been able to assume or establish scientifically. So, like something that's floating free from our understanding of natural laws. That would be a nomological dangler, this mysterious thing that we can't quite comprehend scientifically. Now, if sensations were not brain processes, if they were like the activity of the soul or of the spirit, or as Descartes would just call it, the mind, something disembodied, immaterial, lacking in any extension, and yet capable of consciousness, if that's the essential nature of consciousness, then it's never going to be capable of a scientific explanation or investigation, because it would literally not have any physical basis, and therefore it would be totally incapable of observation and independent inquiry. So his goal is to attack that claim and say that no, sensations, consciousness, it's not a nomological dangler. It's just another physical thing like everything else. It's a brain process, so it's safely contained within the sphere of scientific laws and natural laws and principles. But he has to make the case, right, for physicalism then. Because dualism, again, assumes that the mind is something other than a physical object, something different from the physical body or brain. But that just won't do to a scientist who's trying to subsume all things about reality within the sphere of scientific understanding. So his goal is basically to show us that there's no very good arguments for dualism. He thinks that the only reason that anybody would think that the consciousness you have is not physical is because of the clever arguments that dualists provide for the idea that there's two substances. There's physical matter, but also mind. So he kind of wants to debunk physicalism, I guess you could say, in this paper. He wants to take on the best arguments that physicalists give and then try to show one by one that they really don't succeed. And then, therefore, at the end, he thinks that having demonstrated the failure of the best arguments for dualism, physicalism is the only viable alternative that remains. So his paper kind of proceeds from there as a set of objections and replies. What he basically does is he considers objections that a dualist might give to this identity statement, and then he provides rebuttals, or he attempts at least to provide rebuttals to those different objections to the identity claim. So just so we get the sort of physicalist that thinks everything's physical, including consciousness. He summarizes the view of physicalism as just this: sensations are brain processes. And now, having said that that's his view and that's his position, because otherwise consciousness would be a nomological dangler, that's no good, he goes ahead to consider objections to this claim that might be posed by dualists, and then he tries to rebut those. Okay, so the objections that he states are numbered in the paper, like they're numbered objection 1, objection 2, and once again, these are what? These are objections to his claim that physicalism is true, objections to this identity sentence that says sensations are brain processes. So in the paper, there's a total of, 8 of these objections. But I don't want to really go through all 8 because I didn't think each of them was as important as the others. I kind of wanted to just talk to you about the ones that I found to be of the most defining importance for his paper. So we're going to skip around through some of the objections, but we'll start with number 1. So let me erase this panel, and then the board will be clear, and I'll start giving you guys notes on the different objections that he tries to defend against from a dualist. Okay, so first off, objection 1. So remember now, these are objections to physicalism. He's a physicalist, so he's reporting on these objections just so that he can then attack them or whatever, tear them down. So the first objection says that any average person, an everyday person, can easily talk about their sensations, but cannot really say anything about what is going on in their brain. So the two things must not be the same. Okay, so an average person can easily talk about their sensations, but is unable to say what is going on in their brain. So sensations must not be brain processes. So that's one objection. And let me just try and really explain it to you. So this objection is saying the following, that take the average Joe person, right? Any of us, all the time, can and do have easy conversations about our different sensations that we experience. Okay, so I mean, I could tell you, like the other night, I was watching the Michael Jordan documentary, Last Dance, and I was entertained by it. And there were times during that viewing that I found it funny, and so I laughed. So I'm just explaining to you there, like, oh, I had this experience that I thought was like interesting, entertaining, and at one point funny. Now I'm going through the way it was for me as a subjective experience, right? Or I could tell you, I don't know, last night, I had like some pasta and some salad for dinner, and I thought it was tasty. I thought it was well prepared and flavorful, so I enjoyed the meal. Now I'm giving you a rundown of an experience that I had consuming some food, right? I could tell you I was playing an instrument and I was really jamming and having fun with that, or that I was riding a bike and the wind blowing through my hair. It was a nice sensation or experience. So whatever the experience is that a conscious mind can have, you can talk about it. But the thing is, even though you're able to have those straightforward conversations about your experiences and your sensations, what you're not so much able to do is convert that experience into some talk about what's happening in the brain. So if I told you I had a delicious meal last night, right, that's easy to say. But what I'm not able to do is say, last night, so you asked me how my meal was. And I said, okay, well, let me just put it to you this way. When I started eating, the prefrontal cortex over here, a certain set of neurons started firing. That resulted in a chemical release of certain neurotransmitters on the other side of my brain, and basically that flooded the parietal lobe, and therefore, that's how it felt. So I'm totally making up the brain science story, but that's kind of like the language employed by neuroscientists, right? They talk about centers of the brain and their activity. So the point is that a person can talk about their experiences, and that's easy enough, but they really can't have the same conversation about that experience in terms of it being a brain process. Like most of us have no real knowledge about what's going on underneath the hood, as it were, of our brain. We just have the experiences. We don't think or have even the ability to talk about what those experiences are if we were, for example, just looking at a brain scan and discussing the current state of the physical brain that is supposed to be identical to the experience. So some dualists might say that because it's easy to talk about sensations, but nobody really can say much about what's going on in their brain, how could they be the same thing? You might argue that if they are the same thing, then we should be able to just talk about them both interchangeably. We should be able to say, I was riding my bike, or if you like, I could say that, neurons and synapses were firing in this specific part of the brain. But we can't do that. So someone could argue that this shows they're not the same. Well, how does he reply to this objection? All right, his reply is this reply here. So he's basically saying that even if a person doesn't know that two words or descriptions refer to the same thing, that they still may refer to the same thing. Okay, so two terms can refer to the same object, even if a person is not aware of that fact. Okay, so okay, and I'll type that also so that it's clearly visible in the chat, in the live stream. So I'm just going to write this here too. Two terms or descriptions can refer to the same thing even if a person is not aware that they refer to the same thing. or if they even don't understand that they refer to the same thing. Okay, so there's an example that's given to illustrate this reply. And the example is of the morning and evening star. Okay, so I'm going to erase the objection above so that we can just focus on the reply for a minute. And an example given of this is morning and evening star. Okay, so let me give you a little story that's a true story, which was used as an example by a great German philosopher of the 19th and early 20th century. His name is Gottlob Frege. And he's a great philosopher who really is partially responsible for the invention of more advanced logical languages that later on have become very important towards computer programming and everything. So he had a big influence in philosophy and math and in linguistics, but anyway, and logic. But Gottlob Frege had this example in one of his papers called On Sense and Reference, in German, Sinn und Bedeutung. But this is the example. Okay, so true story. At one point, hundreds of years ago, people who would get up in the early morning and look, let me start it with the night. People who would be up at night looking at the night sky, you know, there'd be this big canopy of stars like we always have. And there was this one object in the night sky that was like the brightest star of all. So it was given a name as the evening star. So what is the evening star? It's the brightest star that's visible in the night sky. Okay, now in the morning time, especially before electricity and light pollution and all that, there would be still some stars visible in the morning sky as well. Okay, and in the early dawn, when these morning stars were visible, the one that was the brightest was also given a name, and it was called the morning star. So what's the evening star? Brightest star in the night sky. What's the morning star? Brightest star in the morning sky. And time passed, and eventually a discovery was made when more powerful telescopes and better observations had been conducted. What do you think was this discovery that was made in the end? Perhaps you can deduce this based on the hints that have been provided in our lead up to this example. So discovery was made concerning these so-called stars. Yes, Matthew, that they're the same star actually, same thing. So the morning star is the evening star, just by a different name. Okay. Now Frege uses that to make a point that although the meaning of the two words is somewhat different, right? Because evening star means, by definition, brightest star visible at the night time. Morning star definition is brightest star visible in the morning time. And those, of course, don't have the same, definitions, but there's not two stars. There's just one star that's being referred twice over by these slightly different descriptors or different labels. Now, suppose Frege says that there were two different people that had extremely different sleeping habits. This is a quite unlikely friendship, but imagine that one person is like the ultimate morning person, and the other person is the ultimate night owl. So even though they don't have many hours that they're both awake, let's say they do have a conversation during one of those overlapping moments where they're both awake, and they have this conversation. Evening star guy says, hey, well, I shouldn't say evening star guy to give too much away, but the evening man says, hey, morning man, buddy, are you ever going to stay up a little bit later? I know you like to go to bed at like 7 p.m. and stuff when the sun is still basically out. But if you would just stay up a little bit later, you're really missing out because there's this beautiful star in the night sky. Have you ever heard of the evening star? It's the brightest star in the evening sky. Because I'm a night person, I look at it every night and it's amazing. It's quite a sight. You really got to see that. What do you think about that, morning guy? The morning guy's like, well, sounds really nice, but the thing is, I'll never stay up that late, so I'm sorry to tell you that, but it sounds really cool. On the other hand, though, you, my friend, I know you like to sleep through the day like a vampire, and you're never awake in the morning. But you really at least a couple times should try to get up earlier because you're missing out on stuff too. Have you ever seen or heard of the morning star? And evening guy's like, morning what? No, I haven't heard of morning anything. I hate the morning. So what is the morning star? And morning guy's like, well, you know, it's we morning people, we see it in the morning. We get up and it's in the sky. It's the beautiful, brightest star in the morning sky. It's like nothing else. So I'm telling you, you gotta go check it out. And he says, maybe someday if I get up early enough, I'll see it. Morning guy's like, okay, well, maybe someday I'll see the evening star. I haven't seen it yet. Now, it looks like these two people, right, are basically having a conversation about two different stars. But in a way, they're kind of talking past one another because they're actually referring to the same thing. Now, just because evening man doesn't know that the morning star is the same star, does that mean that it has to be two different objects? No. So even though their understanding of the two different words would seem to indicate that they are referring to two different objects, they're actually referring to the same thing. And so in another case of like, I don't know, I show up to a party in a costume and I introduce myself under one name, then I come back to the same party later in a different outfit, introducing myself under a different name. Two people that both met me are having a conversation like, did you see this guy John? And the other guy's like, no, but I met this guy Richard. And they're having a conversation about the same person, just using two different descriptions, maybe based on the two different outfits or whatever. So understanding the point here. What's the larger story here? J.J.C. Smart is a physicalist. He objects and refutes dualism. He rejects dualism. A dualist might say sensations cannot be brain processes because we don't have the same ability to talk about them in those two different ways. We talk about our sensations in an easy way, just conversationally, but nobody really has very much ability. Even the most advanced scientists, there's still a lot of gaps in our knowledge about the brain. So it's not so easy to talk about the brain process. If they were the same thing, then we should be able to talk about them both the same way. But now we have Smart saying that's not really true, even though there could be two different labels with two different descriptions completely. Describe it as the deliciousness of the ice cream versus the firing of neurons in the cortex. That looks like two completely different descriptions, certainly is two different set of words, but it could be that they just jointly refer to one common process, one same physical process. So sensations are just brain processes by another name. They don't have to be something over and beyond or different from them just because we have a separate label for them. And that is illustrated by the morning and the evening star, a case where two different labels exist, but there's not two different objects that they refer to. So by creating a different description of myself, I don't multiply myself into more than one being. And that's what we see here, and that's what he's claiming is true of the sensation brain process thing. So there's not two different things, there's just one. They could be described in various different ways through the subjective language of the experience you have or through the objective language of the physical brain process that is happening at the time. But though those are distinct descriptions and labels, they refer to a common thing, which is just the brain process. Okay? He also gives another example. Take this case. So I'll give you another example besides morning and evening star to think of the same little exchange of ideas. Was there ever a point in human history where people had no knowledge of what electricity was? Yes, certainly. But electricity has always kind of existed. You know, just take the case of lightning, right? So a person who looks at lightning, let's say in the year 1300, they may say, wow, big, beautiful flash in the sky. And a person in a more modern time might say, oh, look, a discharge of ions in the Earth's atmosphere. That's the like scientific or physical description. And in the first case, it's just a qualitative description. Suppose that we have a person today who's completely uninformed about science, right? A person who has no knowledge about electricity or anything else. You might say to them, lightning is electricity. And they'll be like, well, I don't know what electricity is, but I know what lightning is. Does that mean that it can't be the same thing as electricity just because the person is unaware of the co-reference of the two descriptions? No, of course it is just electricity. Even if a person is unaware of the principles of electricity and how they operate. So let me read from the book and you'll see exactly how he puts these points. So we can kind of just bring that all together. So here's how he phrases the objection, and he uses a little colorful language, I don't know. He says, this is the way the dualist might object to his identity thesis, that sensations equal brain processes. Any illiterate peasant can talk perfectly well about his sensations or how things look or feel, but he may know nothing about his neurophysiology. A man may, for example, think the brain is an organ that cools the body without any impairment of their ability to make true statements about their sensations. Therefore, the things we are talking about when we describe our sensations cannot be processes in the brain. That's the objection. Now here's his reply. And he says, well, you might as well say that a nation of lazy people who never saw the morning star or knew of its existence, or who had never thought of the expression morning star, but who used the expression evening star perfectly well, could not use this expression to refer to the same entity that we refer to and describe as the morning star. He says, consider lightning. Modern physical science tells us that lightning is a certain kind of electrical discharge due to ionization of clouds of water vapor in the atmosphere. This, it is now believed, is what the true nature of lightning is. Note that there are not two things, a flash of lightning and an electrical discharge. There is one thing, a flash of lightning, which is described scientifically as an electrical discharge to the earth from a cloud of ionized water molecules. The case is not like explaining a footprint by reference to a burglar, because the footprint and the burglar are two separate things. But with the case of lightning and electricity, what lightning really is an electric discharge. Okay, so in short, the reply to objection 1 is that there can be statements of the form A is identical with B, and a person may well know that something is an A without knowing that it is a B. An illiterate peasant, I don't know why he uses this turn of phrase, but an illiterate peasant might well be able to talk about his sensations without knowing about his brain processes, just as he can talk about lightning though he knows nothing of electricity, but yet there's the same thing. Okay, so that's his one attempt to rebut a possible objection to the claim that sensations are brain processes. They are sensations which are the same as brain processes, even though, of course, language would make it appear that those are different things, because the way of describing sensations bears no similarity to the way of describing the processes of the brain, yet they're the same. Okay, so let's go on. A few more of these objections and replies. Okay, so another one is this second objection, that sensations and brain processes do not have the same meaning, and therefore they cannot be the same thing. Have different meanings, so they can't be the same thing. And his reply to this is, again, much similar to the reply of the first objection. In fact, I want to make a point really fast. That first objection that we just went over, that's really the core objection and reply that he advances in this paper. I think that some of the others, as we sort of are going to see now, are a little bit repetitive of the first objection. They kind of sort of state the same point, but in a slightly different way. So if you comprehend that first reply and objection, then you really, I think, have digested the major core of what I wanted you to take away from the JJC SMART paper. But we'll go through some of the other objections briefly as well. So the second one is this, that those terms, sensation and brain process, they don't have the same definition or meaning. So how could they really be the same thing? And his reply is similar to number 1. He just says that words which have different meaning can still have the same reference. So two words can have different meaning, but still refer to the same thing. Okay, so let's see. The term President of the United States doesn't have the same meaning as, I I guess, just to give an example, owner of the Trump organization. Those two words don't have the same definition, but of course they do in this case refer to the same person, that's the president. And so the same is here. Sensation and brain process, you wouldn't see them defined the same way in a dictionary. But although they are defined differently, at least in language, in physical reality, they just refer to one same object. Same with morning star and evening star. The definition of those two terms are different and distinct. One talks about brightness of an object in the morning. One talks about brightness of an object visible in the evening. But though the definitions linguistically are different, that doesn't create two different objects referred to by the two distinct definitions. And so another straightforward reply given by the author. Okay. So let's see. I want to go ahead then to like objection 4, skipping up to that one. Objection 4. So this one's kind of interesting. He says sensations don't have any position in space. They're not located anywhere in space, but the brain process is, so they must be different. Okay. So here's another possible way of trying to push back against the claim that sensations are the same thing as brain processes. You could say, well, the sensation doesn't really have a position anywhere, but the brain process certainly has a location. Where's the location physically of the brain process? Well, it's in your head where the brain is, obviously. But if I ask you right now, have a childhood memory. Like think right now back to a memory of yourself in elementary school, okay? Now, where is the memory at? Is it somewhere in the room? Is it floating around in the room? No. If I opened up your head, dissected the brain, would I find that in there somewhere? No. So you have kind of like a temptation to say there's literally nowhere that my sensations are. But the brain process certainly has a place that it exists. So those two things can't be the same thing. At times in his paper, he uses this example of what he calls an after image, just so that you know what he's referring to there. This is a common experience that has to do with the way vision works. So have you ever noticed that if you look at an object that is a light source, like a light bulb, for just a moment, we don't want you to hurt your eyes, but if you look at it for a moment and then you quickly close your eyes, you'll see the after image, the faint outline of the light source remaining projected within your closed field of vision as like a purplish after image that sort of floats in the blackened field of vision, okay? Like, so if I looked up at my chandelier right above me and closed my eyes, I can see the outline of the light bulbs cast in my field of vision. So it impresses it on the retina and it stays there for a little while. It's an after image. So question, where's the after image at? Is it in the room? Like, would I find this after image physically in the room? Well, no, because it's an element of my subjective sensation. But is it all beneath my eyelids? Is it somewhere in my head? It seems that it's nowhere. So if a sensation like an after image is just a brain process, a person could object by saying they cannot be the same, since the sensation doesn't seem to have a location, but the brain process does. His reply to that is, again, similar to the previous responses. He just says, the experience of the after image is a brain process, and the brain process is located in space. So there's actually, although it sounds awkward to say so, the sensation does have a physical location. We just wouldn't say it normally in everyday life because there would be no purpose in an average conversation to describe the physical whereabouts of the sensations that you have. So the sensation is a brain process and is actually located in space in the brain. So the reason that we just are not in the habit, I guess, of talking about the physical location of our sensations is because it wouldn't serve any practical purpose usually. If you're telling a person, I had this amazing meal, there would never be a real reason to say, and by the way, the experience that I had of that meal was found here in my brain. It's right there in my skull, riding along with my body. I mean, that's something that perhaps true, but would not really be necessary to mention in an everyday situation. So we kind of get led by language into the thought that sensations must be different from brain processes because we talk about our sensations all the time, but we don't speak much about the brain process that is claimed to be equivalent to, or its position, whatever. Now, there were just two more little objections that I kind of wanted to state. Since we're running close to the end, I'm going to just briefly mention them now, and then I'll kind of review them at the beginning on Friday. And on Friday, I also want us to talk about the Alan Turing paper, so I still want us to cover that. Therefore, on Friday morning, you guys just make sure that you read Alan Turing's paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence. That's going to be our last Philosophy of Mind article. And then starting next week, we'll move on to our last subject in the class, which is the value of life and the question of life and death. But two more objections I wanted to go over. One is objection 6. It says that sensations are private, but brain processes can be publicly observed, so they must not be the same thing. Basically, okay, when you have a sensation, only you can sense that sensation. So if you, if you pinch yourself, you feel the pain, but it's private to your own experience. On the other hand, though, the brain process is something that we could look at if we had the proper tools. We could do a brain scan when the person pinches themselves, look at the brain scan and see the part of the brain that becomes active, which is therefore responsible for the felt experience of the pain. So nobody can look at your pain experience, but I guess they can look at the brain state. So if one thing is essentially private and the other is publicly observable, how could they really be the same thing? His reply to that is the same kind of reply. He says, once again, this is a difference in language, not a difference in physical reality. The language of a subjective experience is not the same kind of language we would employ if we were to describe the physical brain process, which is identical to that experience. But again, as before, a linguistic difference in two descriptions or ways of speaking does not necessarily amount to an actual physical difference of two objects. So there's a difference in language, but that's a linguistic norm, not a physical norm. Final objection that I wanted to talk about is what you could call Descartes' objection. And that's the idea that, but hold on, I can imagine myself existing and having thoughts and sensations even if I had no body and no brain at all, right? Because Descartes says, who knows, maybe your body is just a big illusion, but you're thinking. So since you can doubt the existence of the body but not the mind, doesn't that show that the sensations cannot be brain processes? Because if a sensation was a brain process, then you'd think it couldn't possibly exist without the brain. But some people argue anyway that it's imaginable for you to have sensations even if you didn't have a body at all. So what about that? In reply to that, he says, if you really think that your sensations could exist without any body attached, then you must believe that the thing which is responsible for your consciousness is some type of ghost. Not the brain, but like a ghost or a spirit. And he says, that's okay, fine, that's a theory then, the ghost theory of consciousness. And what he says in the end is, all I can really do is tell you, I cannot definitively prove that that's false, but all I have is to offer you an alternative theory. So he says, let's put these two theories on the same table and see which one has more evidential and plausible backing. And if it's the brain theory of consciousness versus the ghost theory of consciousness, he just figures that there's a little bit more empirical support and rationale behind the brain hypothesis. So that's kind of where he closes his paper, and he thinks at the end that he successfully refuted a number of attempted objections from dualism against physicalism, and therefore in the end he closes the case and says physicalism is my view of the better view, that I think it's true. Okay guys, well, I don't want to keep you much longer for now, so we did, I think, well. We got through the JJC Smart article. Appreciate you guys' attendance, and getting up early wherever you guys are at. hopefully now you're on to a great day, and I'll be in touch with you guys as we continue. So just try to read Alan Turing for Friday, and stay safe, everyone. Stay healthy, and we'll get through this fine. But I'll see you guys on Friday then. Okay? Take care, and until next time. Bye bye. Thank you.